Hey there and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Season 6, Episode 13 of the Roast West Coast Coffee Podcast. I'm Ryan Wolt, and this is the show where I bring you the stories of coffee professionals, entrepreneurship, and coffee education. Today's guest is John Pierson. He's the founder of Servant Coffee in Denver, Colorado. He's also an unlikely entrepreneur who at one point actually made a promise that he wouldn't start his own business. In today's conversation, we're going to cover that, how he made the career move from a big corporate energy company to the coffee industry, the value of travel, and how in entrepreneurship and, frankly, life, things often don't go as planned. John was kind enough to send me a few bags of coffee, and the best compliment I can give any coffee roaster is that when I try it, I want to share it with my own coffee-loving, often coffee-roasting friends, which is exactly what I did after I first enjoyed Servant's honey-processed Bolivia coffee while editing this show. Unfortunately, I'm all out of that. So while you're listening to the interview, I'll be online at servantcoffee.com ordering more coffee. And I hope that wherever you are listening, be it for the coffee or for the inspirational entrepreneurial stories, you have a cup of your own roasted craft coffee that is so good, so tasty, that you want to share it with your friends too. Enjoy that cup and enjoy this conversation with John Pierson, founder of Servant Coffee.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks for being here. Welcome to the show, the Roast West Coast Coffee Podcast. I always forget to say that at the beginning. If you wouldn't mind, for everybody who's going to be listening to this show, just let us know your name, the name of your company, in your role there, and then maybe what your favorite place to travel to in the world is. So just a very simple, easy question.
No problem. So my name is John Pierson. I'm the owner and founder of Servant Coffee, based here in Denver, Colorado. And we've been in business for about 2.5 years now. So let's see, travel. That's always a hard question because my wife is actually a travel agent and we love to travel. So on pretty much anywhere in the UK is our favorite because we spent the first 5.5 years of our marriage living in London. So I love to go to crazy exotic places, but going back to London is just so sentimental for me and my family. So we love it there.
Well, I had a ulterior motive for asking that question because I knew that that's what your wife did. And since we're right at the beginning of the show and everyone's still listening, I want to make sure that we shout out Purposeful Wanderings, and I'll link to that in the show notes.
Cool.
Is the name of the company I believe your wife works with.
That's right.
And I was reading through it and just kind of learning that story earlier before the show. Really interesting for anyone who also likes to travel, which a lot of coffee people do.
Totally.
Let's kind of go back in time a little bit, John. I really wanted to learn a little bit more about you, specifically kind of if you had any sort of first experiences with coffee that maybe foretold this future in which you owned a coffee company.
Yeah, definitely. So a little of my background, and I would say the first time from a coffee experience perspective was I was drinking office coffee in corporate America, and my first cup was about, I would say, 26 years old. So I didn't drink coffee when I was younger, and it was more cream and sugar with a little dash of coffee in there. So I kind of grew up in that office environment with very cheap coffee, but hey, it got us through the day and gave us that little caffeine boost that we needed. And so, I think my road with coffee has been an evolution over time. So sometimes I can relate a lot to our office clients because I used to drink, very, low end coffee. So there's something out there for everyone, honestly, when it comes to coffee. So that was kind of my first experience with it. And it kind of grew from there and evolved over time, into the specialty coffee world.
Where in the world were you? You obviously don't have a British accent, so I'm guessing you moved to England at some point. Where were you in corporate America, and what were you doing before this coffee career started?
Yeah, so I spent the first, coming out of college, I was actually a mechanical engineer leaving university in Texas. I grew up most of my life in Houston. I went to Texas A&M for undergrad, did engineering there, came back to Houston and worked in the energy industry. And I worked for the same company for 15 years. So my first 10 years were in Houston. And then right around that same time is when I met Sarah and we got married. And 2 months after getting married, we moved overseas and I got transferred over to London. So we were in London just over 5 years before I left that one company. And then that was kind of the transition point, taking a little bit of a sabbatical and traveling with the kids, just thinking about, what we were going to do next. And that's how we kind of landed into the coffee world.
Well, that's an interesting thing is that you left your job trying to figure out where you were going next. What was the tipping point that made you think not only opening your own business, which is its own challenge, but opening one in coffee was the thing that you wanted to do?
Yeah, it was not immediate. I mean, I actually left my company thinking I would stay in the energy industry. I just kind of wanted to work for a smaller company, and so thinking about that and taking a little bit of time away, I was always a lover of coffee as a consumer. I kind of, like I said before, evolved kind of over time into what I was drinking and what I liked, and then living in London was, really transformational just in terms of the style because it's so much more of an espresso based culture, in the UK and in Europe versus in the US where we drink a lot more drip coffee. And so that's where I think a lot of the change, was happening. And I kind of joke with my wife, I think I threw her for a loop that I told her when I left that I would never be an entrepreneur. I always wanted to work for a smaller company, but I never really wanted to start something on my own. But there, plans change and things evolve. But I think the tipping point, which kind of hopefully answers your question more directly, is that when we landed back in the US and we decided we were going to go move back to the US, we had a bit of time until we were closing on our house in Denver, which we had chosen. And so we decided, let's go to Colombia because my wife wanted to see it from a tourism perspective. She was getting more and more requests, and I really wanted to go experience coffee at origin. I mean, I really needed to understand the agricultural side more if this was something I wanted to do. And so we did that with our kids. We took our two young kids down to Colombia. We were there about 2.5 weeks, stayed on two different coffee plantations and really just tried to be a sponge and soak up as much information as we could. And I really fell in love with what the service of kind of this next wave of coffee was bringing to the world. So more transparency, more direct relationships with either the farmer or the co-op that you're sourcing from. And I just thought, man, this could really make a difference in people's lives. And so that's kind of the evolution of Servant Coffee, and where we got the name was that we always felt like we need that daily reminder to serve other people first before ourselves. And I need that on a constant, on a daily basis. So it helps me a lot as I approach work.
That's really interesting. I don't want to kind of hammer you with this kind of question, but I don't want to lose this little bit of thread either, where you made a promise to your wife that you weren't going to be an entrepreneur, that you weren't going to start your own thing. And something changed to make you think, not only can I do this, but I can convince her that it's a good idea. I mean, obviously you wanted to bring coffee and this idea of serving others into your company, but what made you decide to do that for yourself instead of just getting a job in coffee or working for another great roasters? I mean, Denver is famous for having great coffee. I go to Denver a couple times a year just to drink beer and coffee. So
Yep.
what made you decide, if I'm going to do this, I'm doing it for me?
Well, I think there was kind of a two-stage process. One, I think I'm still daily trying to convince my wife that this is a great idea. But she has been an amazing rock and level of support for Servant Coffee, and has been involved in different stages of the growth of the business. But so I genuinely believe that both we each have our own company, but they're both our companies really at the end of the day, because that's how we look at it. But I think the decision to really start my own thing, I gave myself once we moved to Denver. I kind of said, okay, we sort of moved here in like mid-September, and I said, I'm going to give myself basically until the holidays to decide what we're going to do, and whether that was going to try to apply and work at one of the local roasters first to learn the industry, or to jump out and do our own thing. And so I always thought if I found the right culture and the right fit and the right owner, that I would potentially do that. But I just spent literally that time from sort of mid September up until Christmas time of that first year here in Denver, just doing as much research as I possibly could. And I met almost all of the owners of the local coffee roasteries here in Denver, and they were phenomenal. I mean, everybody, I couldn't believe how open of an environment it was. Everybody told me what worked well, what didn't work well, whether or not to get into retail, which is always a really interesting point. But in just the challenges really of running a roastery and setting it up and doing everything. And so I had a local connection when we were in Columbia as well to a guy who was from Columbia but was living in Denver and was a little bit involved in kind of the industry and was also selling tea. And so that relationship fostered a lot of this development from the ground up. And he said, it was kind of a lot of his recommendations that I relied on. I said, well, I'm thinking about doing this. Do you want to give me a hand? And he said yes. And so we were kind of off and running at that point. And there probably was one or two roasteries that I could have seen myself working at, but I think at that point I just felt very compelled to jump off and get rolling and do my own thing. So I had a vision already for kind of what the brand would look like and what the feel of the company would look like. And so I just think there was a huge amount of, I felt like we needed to just take ownership from day one. And I always felt like I was the worst. I was like, everybody's critic, right? I think a lot of us walk into coffee shops and we walk into bakeries or we walk into any sort of like food service and we're always thinking critically about, oh, I would change this, I wouldn't do that. And I said, well, I think I'm done with that. I'm going to do it, the way that we want to, and we'll see if it's successful. So I think there was that jump off point that I was just ready to do it.
My wife has told me many times that I have ruined the experience of going to restaurants for her because when I walk in, that's the first thing I'm doing is looking around with a critical eye. And it doesn't mean that I don't appreciate the work that's being done or how great it is. It's just those are the things I see first after spending so many years trying to fix those things in places that I was working in. You mentioned wholesale and retail. You do have a cafe, although I will say you open late, which is why I didn't get a chance to visit while I was in Denver recently, later in the morning, at least than your neighbors. But you clearly do both. What made you decide to go with a place that people can come and visit as well as wholesale?
So our thing is a little bit misleading, honestly, because when you fill out, there's a little thing with Google when we first launched. So we have a space on Santa Fe in between second and third, and that's our headquarters and roastery and fulfillment location. And we don't have a Servant Coffee branded retail location yet. However, at the roastery, we have a little tasting room in the front that if you were looking at the pictures, it looks like it's a retail outlet, but
Oh,
we're not zoned for actual retail. So we don't sell cappuccinos and lattes there.
great to know. I'm glad I didn't drive over then.
But what's funny now is that after a couple of years now, you kind of have built up a lot more in your Google search deal. So when we get people that walk in the front door every 2 to 3 days now, and they're
Oh,
like,
really? Yes.
"Can we get a cappuccino?"
I definitely thought you did.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
you
and
weren't
that's
the only one. I will say I was traveling for about 8 weeks and I went to at least three roasters, like physically walked in the door expecting to get coffee and had to have them tell me, we don't do that here. And to anyone listening, if that happens to you, I don't know why I looked over at my microphone. There's nobody here in the closet with me, but instinctive. But if that happens to you, ask the people there where do they get coffee in the morning, if not their own roastery, because they probably know what's around. And I found some great coffee shops that way.
yep.
Then your focus is wholesale. You are not only jumping into a new industry, starting a new business, you're living in a new city, you have your Columbia connection, and you went out and aggressively are meeting other roasters. How did you start getting clients? How did people start finding out about you? What was your process for that?
I walked in their front door, honestly. So it was about as simple as that. And Sarah and I, one of the blessings that we had from day one is that I think anytime you start, any type of entrepreneur reaches out and starts a new business, particularly if it's a consumer product, you just immediately go to your connections. And a lot of that is friends and family. And we feel so blessed to have really great friends and family. And everybody has been so supportive. And I mean, I really feel like your growth in that first year is just so much word of mouth. I mean, your own effort puts a lot into it, but you have to do a lot of things. You can't spend all your time driving around and looking for new clients. I mean, you have a new facility and you have inspections and you just have marketing. I mean, you have so many different things you're dealing with. So, that early support is what really helped get us off the ground. It was a lot of, just hustling, at the end of the day. So we have a lot of direct consumers as well. They go directly to our website. Obviously we did no marketing. I mean, I spent no dollars on marketing for the first year and a half effectively. So a lot of it was word of mouth and just getting the word out. And then obviously we launched in late 2019. So it was like October, November 2019. So 5 months later, the pandemic hits. And some of the wholesale clients that we'd gotten on board were offices and churches. And that coffee consumption went to zero overnight. So we were faced with some serious challenges. So I've learned wholeheartedly as an entrepreneur, you have to embrace change. You can have a plan, you can have a good solid business plan, but you have to be able to accept change, I feel like, at all times. And so we kind of had to pivot at that point. And I always thought we would go into grocery at some point, but it would be way further down the line. And the pandemic was just brought out that, hey, this is where the whole consumer, this is where everybody's going. Everybody's going to grocery stores because it's the only place that's open. And so that was a huge lesson for us, is just, jumping off and changing course. And we got really lucky. The buyer for the region of Whole Foods was living in Denver, and I got connected to him somehow just by calling him up, and we sent them their coffee, and 3 days later they accepted us. So,
Wow.
and about 6 months later we were on the shelf. So it takes a long time from an approval perspective, but that was a huge help to our business. And so it's kind of finding that balance between, what we call retail, or what would I'd say like a direct consumer model, where they're buying directly from your website, and true wholesale, to cafes and offices, churches, this type of thing. So
Knowing that that's been your process so far and you pivoted kind of early in the pandemic, I think it's great that a lot of groceries, Whole Foods included, are offering local coffees at their groceries. Even large chains, you can generally find a local coffee if that is where you're buying coffee. I always like it when people go right to the source, but it's still sales to that business, so that's great. What do you see for the future of the brand or of the company? Is there going to be a retail cafe someday? Is it a bigger footprint in grocery? Where do you see this expanding out to, or not, for that matter?
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, right now we are really content kind of with what we're doing. We feel like there's still a lot of runway. I love that we are very focused on roasting and bringing a great product to the market. And at the end of the day, I want to make sure that we deliver value to our clients. I think a lot of people realize, I think they're willing to spend a little extra on a bag of coffee if they feel like you're delivering value within that. And so that's kind of my core message to our team that we're trying to live out right now. And I still think we have a significant amount of runway to do that. I certainly haven't ruled out retail, but right now we're not really actively looking at that. But that doesn't mean to say that if a great opportunity came up, we wouldn't maybe jump at it. So again, I think you do have to be open to change, but it changes your lifestyle too. I mean, there are costs that come along with that. And I've learned that from some of our good friends here in Denver who, are running their roastery and running a couple of retail outlets. And, all of a sudden your weekends change a lot. So I think, you just have to be prepared for that. And having two young children, I really value my time with them on the weekends. And so that has always taken priority for me, is being with my kids on the weekends. They're both now in in elementary school, so we don't see them, that much during the day, during the week, obviously. But as they get older, things will tend to change, and we'll see. I think there's the retail business in Denver is pretty strong, and what I love about Colorado is it's full of a lot of people that like to support local businesses, so that's always a positive.
I'm struck. There's a photo on the wall behind you, I believe, is that Brazil?
Yep, correct.
Yep. I'm struck by how much it looks like your logo, at least in layout of what I believe is like a horned goat on top of a mountain. It kind of has a similar vibe to it. How did you come up with the branding design of your company, and how does that play into the servant concept if it does?
Yeah, let's see. Okay, so the picture first is those come from my days back in energy. And even though I was based in Houston, we were a large firm across the world, and so I did a lot of traveling to a lot of our major facilities, and so I would go to Rio, once to twice a year, and I loved it there. I mean, it's really dynamic, it's really fun, and there's always every Sunday there's an art festival. I think it's in Ipanema, where all the local artists come out and they display their works, and you go down there. And so I bought this and then brought it back and had it mounted here, just because I love the black and white and the shade. But that's kind of the coastline of Rio de Janeiro, which I still think is one of the most beautiful in the world. So I've had that picture for quite a long time now, and I think it's just irony, that it looks a little similar to our logo. So I did work with kind of a design firm when we were building out the brand and the color palette, the feel, and all that kind of stuff, because I am at heart not a creative person. I am more of an engineer, and I would say more kind of like business analyst, strengths. I'm not a creative design person. So I knew I always needed help, from a professional firm to help with doing all the assets of the company. So we worked together on that collectively. We told them who we are, what we represent, and then they started working on the feel of the brand until we got to something that we agreed upon. And that was a really cool process because I got to see some guys in action do things that I just had no idea about. So when we found that when they were working on the logo, I was always really critical about that because I believe I'm really tied in with the logo. I was like, I really want the logo to be something very eye catching and cool because I just love being able to put the logo on things, but have it be subtle. I'm not as big a fan of like putting a big brand all over a t-shirt. I'd rather have something small that kind of represents who we are and not have it be overwhelming. So I told them the only stipulation, I'll let you guys do whatever you want with the logo. The only stipulation I have is not to use any animals. I'm not really big on animals in logos. And they were like, okay, yeah, we understand that. No problem. We come to the design meeting. Sarah, my wife, is with me, and they show us 12 logos and kind of talk through the intricacies. And they did a lot of play on the S and C and that kind of stuff. And we're sitting there, and there's this animal one up in the corner, and Sarah and I look at each other and we're like, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I like that one the best.
Well, it worked. I know I was looking through your website the other day, and my wife kind of looked over my shoulder and saw like some of your t-shirts and hoodies and things. And she's like, oh, I like those. She's like, did they have good coffee? Like, would you be okay if we got some? And I was like, well, I haven't had their coffee yet, but we'll, let me talk to John and see if he's a good guy. We'll see if we can.
Well, don't worry. We'll be sending you free coffee. I've got extra.
No. That's not my pitch here. I'm just saying the design worked, that she was ready to buy it based on just looking over my shoulder. Well, I'll make sure that I post photos of kind of something similar to what you have in the background there, and then the logo, and people can kind of decide for themselves if maybe that sunk into your subconscious somewhere.
Cool.
How has the coronavirus been treating your company? I'm assuming in the beginning it was mostly just you and support from your family, and roasting coffee, and you mentioned going and being the sales and bringing in people. How did you kind of function your business during the coronavirus early days before we understood a little bit better about how to interact with the world?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of guess I gave you a little bit of the one story there where we sort of pivoted and went into grocery much earlier than I ever expected. I mean, I was also not sure whether we'd ever go into grocery, but pandemic was something that changed the world. and the way you looked at the world. So, we really had to think differently. It was a blessing and a curse for us. The one thing I think is if we had a bigger direct to consumer brand where people were drinking at home, I think it would have been a massive gift because everybody started ordering more coffee. But we were so young that we didn't have thousands of clients ordering coffee at home. We maybe had like 100 or something like that. So that consumption definitely helped, but people drinking one extra bag, of coffee at home is not going to change your business overnight. So we really just completely had to think differently. So the blessing side of it is that we were very small. We didn't have a large overhead. Obviously, we're paying rent on our space, but I did not have a lot of employees and I didn't have any cafes that I had to shut down. So in those regards, I would say we were lucky for that. So we really buckled down, brought our cost level structure down, and then went out and tried to get, new business where we could, so it was obviously a little bit more limited during that time. And the growth was a little bit slower than what we anticipated. But because I kind of believe in a very low operating cost model and then building upon that, we were lucky to kind of make it through without a lot of, and I didn't really even have to cut back the guys' hours that I had. I had about 2 guys working for me at the time and really didn't have to trim them back much at all. I just filled them with other stuff to do. So we were lucky that we were small and it didn't drown us at the time. And we were always being labeled in food production. And because you're in food production, we were really never in doubt. I don't think we were ever that in danger of being shut down because like you've seen, like our roastery, we're not open to the public. So obviously we weren't welcoming people in at all. Our team were taking the necessary precautions in the facility, but in a lot of ways it's safer because you're just interacting with the same people every day. You're not interacting with a diverse group of people every day. So we definitely had to think a little bit differently, but we were lucky to get through that.
You mentioned earlier that one of the things the coronavirus did is it changed how people looked at the world. You come from a fairly travel heavy background, both for work and then with your family, and your wife is a travel agent. I know when I first reached out to you, you were traveling overseas somewhere. I'm wondering, your thoughts on kind of the value of travel and how you see that differently now as opposed to, say, 2 years ago when travel was really restricted. And if you've been on any origin trips or if that's part of kind of the future for you in the coffee side of things.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think the pandemic showed us is I think in general, most people really appreciate and enjoy travel. I mean, my wife I think when you don't have something, it kind of shows you how much you miss it too. So for us, I don't think we really look at travel that differently. We just think about how quickly it can be taken away, and so let's treasure and value the time that we do have to interact with the world. I think Sarah and I both are big believers that travel opens your eyes and it allows you to see and experience other cultures, which can give you a new perspective, and I think new perspectives are always good, regardless of, some are positive, some are negative, but it helps form a nice, a viewpoint of what other people face in the world. We're very blessed here in America to have a lot. Clearly there are people struggling here too, without a doubt, but life is very different when you go to Africa, which I spent a lot of time in, in energy, and life's very different in India versus Europe and Asia. So I just love having those diverse experiences because it's definitely shaped the way I look at the world. So, I mean, I hope that answers your question, but yeah, and in terms of origin trips, I kind of set out a goal for our company that we do one origin trip at minimum a year. And hopefully we get to the point to do more, but we have to balance that, with being a small company as well. So, the guys, they've already been to Guatemala this year. Sometimes I go, but honestly, what's more important to me is the team goes. Sarah and I feel very lucky that we've been able to travel to a lot of these places. And so I want our guys who are the real value behind our brand. I mean, I don't believe that Serving Coffee is really mine. It's really the company. It's ours as a whole, the collective union of us. So I want all of them to be vested in our success. And so our head of operations and our head of coffee, they went down to Guatemala this year. and then our head of coffee, he went to Rwanda last year. So I'm a big believer that we have to foster and maintain, those relationships at origin. I think it's the core of who we are. I think there's a lot of, lip service in coffee. I think a lot of people write about origin stories, but when you ask them, have they been there? Have they met anybody? It sometimes is not what it seems. So I want to make sure that we prioritize that and value that. And I'm very open and honest with everybody that I say, we don't know every one of our producers. We would love to, and that can be very difficult to do and very expensive. So there has to be a little bit of a balance. So we're trying to make sure that we do prioritize that in our business, and we go to origin every year somewhere.
Sure. In the same way that I, as a customer, am putting my trust in the roasters that I support or buy coffee from, I'm trusting that they're doing some of the work to figure out, the chain between them and origin. You're also doing that with perhaps a green buyer, salesman, or a company that's sourcing coffee for you. And that just is a growing trust that grows over time as you learn that people do things the way that match your values. You have a family, young kids, you mentioned, and you prioritize your weekends. I'm wondering how being an entrepreneur has impacted kind of the rest of your life as opposed to working for I was going to say corporate overlord, but that's not what I meant. But for working for a larger company, has it been a good transition for you as a person, and and for being around, or for your family who are seeing you in a different way than maybe they did before?
Yeah, it's very much a different day-to-day routine, I would say. So overall, it's been an absolute net positive through and through. But that's not to say it didn't come with some real adjustment, especially in the first year. It might have actually prepared us for the pandemic much more than other people, because it was over a solid year and a half that my wife and I had been more around each other and having our own businesses and a little bit more flexibility with time and working from home. So in a lot of ways, that prepared us a lot for the pandemic. We didn't really feel like our life changed that much compared to a lot of people that were out there and used to go into an office every day for 8 to 10 hours. So it was definitely an adjustment. I worked for much larger company, and in Europe I traveled almost every week, at least for one night. So I was never gone for very long stints, but I did do a lot of corporate travel. So it was a big adjustment being an entrepreneur, running my own business, and then not having to travel as much. But we really I really feel like Sarah and I have got into a really good rhythm of kind of what our responsibilities were around the house, and how I kind of took on a little bit more now, being around more often, so that freed her up to do a little bit more work. And so, we're always trying to find that right balance, with the kids, and at the end of the day, our marriage, our faith comes first, our marriage comes second, our kids come third, right there. So, we just want to make sure we always are keeping our priorities straight. Work is down the list, no matter what's going on. So we just try to remind ourselves of that even during, tough times. So.
Sure. Is there anything that we didn't kind of cover today that you want people to know about your coffee roastery, about your trajectory, about what you're offering, the rest of us, the world?
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like we are a coffee company that is really trying to do things the right way. And we are always on the lookout for clients, who want to get in line with our vision and support that. So I'm a big believer that we should be open, honest, transparent, and just serve people well. So we try to fit the model for what works at different clients, whether that's cafes or churches or offices, or direct consumer, right to your household. So we try to be very available anytime people have questions. And so I really feel like we need to be a service company first. So I've learned from some of the greatest companies that are out there. One of my favorite quotes is from the Zappos founder, Tony Hsieh, which I think he passed away recently, which is incredibly sad. But I love his interviews. One person asked him, was like, "What kind of shoes do you wear if you're in this you own this big, huge shoe company. And he goes, I really have one pair of shoes and I've had them for like 5 years. I really don't care about shoes at all. And the guy goes, I mean, you must be kidding, right? Like you got to have a closet. No, he's like, no, I really don't care about shoes at all. I kind of fell into this business. I mean, I really feel like we're a customer service company first who just happens to sell shoes on the side. And I just love that quote. I'm like, that's what business is to me. I think you have to service clients first and foremost, and people can buy really good coffee in a lot of different places. So I never say that we're the best, but we want to serve people first. And if we can do that and relay the message and the value behind our brand, then I think that's a success, at the end of the day. And so we try to live that out all the way up and down our company, from where we source at origin to how we service our clients to how we support our employees, and also how we deliver back to our local community here in Denver. So if you want any information about the two charities, we support two local charities here in Denver that we have a huge heart for. They're doing great work. That's Mile High Workshop and Providence Network. They're both under our community impact tag on our website. So you can read more information about there, and we have links to go straight to their website. So we always want to be a big advocate, for those who are less fortunate than us. So.
And I'll make sure that those are linked in this podcast show notes, wherever you're listening to the show, and on the newsletter as well. Unlike Tony Shea, I'm assuming you drink coffee regularly. You mentioned you enjoy a cup of coffee. You care about the coffee you're drinking, obviously. When you go out and get a cup of coffee somewhere, whether it's just for yourself or for research, or it's a Saturday morning, what do you drink?
My favorite drink by far is a flat white. And so I think I got so used to drinking those over in Europe. And I think we also get a little bit spoiled a lot of times because the baristas typically, in a major city like London, it's amazing how many people are so gifted at being a barista. I mean, I think the value behind that is just sometimes lost, and so that's by far my favorite thing to drink, and what I kind of compare different coffee shops against, because I like shorter drinks because I get so much more of the flavor and the variety of the espresso out. So that's by far, those and cortados both, they're not that dissimilar, so those are probably my two favorite to get. And yeah, if anybody ever reaches out to me, I mean, I always send people to certain cafes around Denver. We have a lot of good roasters and a lot of good cafes here. So
awesome. Well, John, I just really appreciate you being on the show, sharing, some of your story, and for putting yourself out there and saying, this is what I can offer and what I can serve to the world, and with your company. So thanks for doing that and for being here on Roast West Coast.
Hey, thanks a lot, Ryan. I really appreciate it. And thank you again for having us on.
Okay, to recap, nothing ever goes as planned, not even on podcasts. I made an assumption based on some Googling that Servant Coffee had a cafe, which they don't. And in the moment, in our interview, I had to adjust. It was a very small deviation in the grand scheme of things. John and his team had to make a much bigger adjustment, re-identifying who their customers were and how they could engage with them and new customers when the pandemic hit. Being a new and still small and nimble company enabled Servant to pivot, turning their wholesale sites toward the grocery chain markets, which wasn't something they were planning on doing at the time. For John, and for all entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs, being willing to accept change as it comes is a key skill. Those perfect business plans don't always hold up in the real world. At Servant Coffee, and for John's family, travel is important. It helps that his wife Sarah runs a travel agency, Purposeful Wanderings, link on roastwestcoast.com. For John, travel serves as a way to connect with other cultures, including the producers of the coffee his team roasts. It's why one of their company goals is to send the team on an origin trip at least once every year, which, if that's the case, I'll be following at Servant Coffee on Instagram, keeping an eye out for job openings. Thanks to John for taking the time to appear on the Roast West Coast Coffee podcast, the really lovely coffee he sent me, and for sharing his story, which will no doubt inspire another entrepreneur listening to this show right now. Also, a big thanks to the rest of the show's roast industry partners, including Café Laterre, Steady State Coffee Roasting, Camp Coffee Company, Coffee Cycle Roasting, Ignite Coffee Company, Maria Coffee, Cape Horn Coffee Importers, Ascend Coffee Roasters, and Moster Coffee Company. I can't remind you enough to get your Mosterland Experience tickets now. Their anniversary is less than a month away. Details on mostercoffee.com. The links to all of those businesses, as always, can be found on roastwestcoast.com. Please check it out and subscribe to the newsletter. And I also need to thank this show's paid subscribers. You make this show happen. This show can be found wherever great podcasts are found, including Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts, where it really helps me out if you tap that 5 stars button. But the very best way to support is by joining those paid subscribers and following the newsletter on roastwestcoast.com. Thank you all. Before I go, I want to send my thoughts out to everyone in Florida. I'm recording before we know the full details of what the impacts of Hurricane Ian are, but I know that I'm grateful my father, who lives in Cape Coral, Florida for half the year, was back in Wisconsin when this storm hit this morning. Because natural disasters don't discriminate. They just devastate. Fingers crossed, this storm ends up being more bluster than expected. This episode of the Roast West Coast Coffee Podcast has been written, produced, and recorded by me, Ryan Wolt. I hope this episode has found you happy, healthy, and with at least enough sanity to make it through the day. Always tip your baristas, and be sure to drink good coffee